The bell above the bakery door had not rung in over 3 hours, and Nora Hargrove stood behind the counter counting 6 crumpled dollar bills for the 4th time, as if repeating the motion might somehow make the number grow. It did not. $6. That was all that stood between her and an empty refrigerator, and somewhere in the back of her mind she was already doing the terrible arithmetic of whether to spend it on bread for her son's lunch or save it for the bus fare she would need in the morning. She was 29 years old, a single mother, and by every measure that mattered to the world around her, she was invisible. And it was on that very afternoon, with those $6 folded into her palm like a small, fragile secret, that her life was about to change forever, not because of anything she did, but because of what she found lying forgotten on the sidewalk outside the bakery door. If a story about kindness, second chances, and the quiet courage of an honest heart moves something in you, I want to invite you to be part of our community here. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about a time someone's honesty restored your faith in people, share it with someone who could use a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our family here believes that forgiveness and integrity still matter in this world, and stories like Nora's remind us why. Now let me take you back to that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when everything was about to change. The bakery where Nora worked was called Hollow Bread, a narrow little shop wedged between a shuttered shoe repair store and a laundromat that always smelled faintly of bleach. It was owned by a widow named Margaret Doyle, a stern but soft-hearted woman in her 60s who had inherited the shop from her late husband and kept it running more out of loyalty to his memory than any hope of real profit. Nora had worked there for almost 2 years, ever since her husband, Daniel, no, not Daniel, she reminded herself even now, months later, forbidding herself from thinking his name because it hurt too much, ever since her husband had left without warning, taking with him the last of their savings and leaving her alone with their 7-year-old son, Milo, and a stack of bills that seemed to multiply overnight like something alive and hungry. Nora was not an unusual woman in the sense that her suffering was rare. Poverty rarely announces itself with theatrics. It creeps in quietly, through unpaid electric bills, through the particular shame of pretending you are not hungry so your child does not notice, through the exhausting arithmetic of survival that never really stops even when you sleep. She had learned to stretch a dozen eggs into a week of meals, to patch Milo's shoes with glue and cardboard, to smile brightly when other mothers at his school talked about vacations and new toys, because pity was a thing she could not afford either. Pride, strange as it sounds, was one of the last luxuries she still possessed, and she guarded it fiercely. That Tuesday had been unusually slow. Rain had been threatening all day without ever quite falling, and the gray sky seemed to have kept most customers indoors. Margaret had left early for a doctor's appointment, leaving Nora alone to close the shop. At exactly 5 in the afternoon, she flipped the sign on the door to "Closed," pulled her thin cardigan tight around her shoulders, and stepped outside to sweep the small stretch of sidewalk in front of the bakery, a ritual she performed every evening more out of habit than necessity. It was there, half-tucked beneath the edge of a green awning post, that she noticed something dark and leather-bound lying against the curb. At first she assumed it was trash, perhaps a discarded notebook or a forgotten takeout menu, but when she nudged it with the broom, she realized it was a wallet. Not just any wallet, but a thick, expensive one, its leather buttery soft and stitched with a quiet elegance that spoke of money in a way Nora had almost forgotten existed. She crouched down and picked it up carefully, glancing around the street as though the rightful owner might materialize out of thin air. Her hands, chapped from hours of kneading dough and washing dishes in water too hot for gloves, trembled slightly as she opened the wallet. Inside, she found a driver's license with a photograph of a silver-haired man with sharp, assessing eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed used to being obeyed. The name on the license read Sebastian Renfield. Tucked behind the license were several platinum credit cards, a folded receipt from a private jet charter company, and, most staggeringly, a thick fold of $100 bills that Nora did not dare to count in public. She would learn later, when she finally counted it in the privacy of her small apartment, that it amounted to just over $4,200 in cash alone, an amount of money so far beyond her daily reality that holding it felt almost like holding something radioactive. For a long moment, Nora simply stood there on the sidewalk, the wallet heavy and warm in her hands, while inside her chest a war she had not expected began to rage. She thought of Milo's shoes, the soles now separating at the toe, held together with a strip of duct tape she had cut to look almost invisible. She thought of the electricity bill sitting unopened on her kitchen counter, the red, final notice, stamped across the top in letters that seemed to mock her every time she walked past it. She thought of the $6 still folded in her apron pocket, and how $4,200 might as well have been $4 million, because either amount was equally impossible for a woman like her to earn through anything but backbreaking labor stretched across months. No one would know, a small voice inside her whispered. The man had not been standing at the door demanding his wallet back. No security cameras hung above this particular stretch of sidewalk, she knew, because Margaret complained about it constantly whenever there was a minor theft in the neighborhood. She could walk into her apartment tonight, pay off the electricity bill, buy Milo a new pair of shoes, put real food in the refrigerator, and no one on this earth would ever be the wiser. The temptation was not abstract or distant, it was immediate, physical, a hunger as real as the empty ache in her stomach from skipping lunch so Milo could have an extra sandwich that morning. And yet, as she stood there with the wallet in her hands, another memory rose unbidden, her grandmother, Eleanor, sitting on the porch of the small house where Nora had spent her childhood summers, telling her in that slow, deliberate way she had of speaking truths that mattered, "Honey, poverty can take almost everything from a person, but it can never take who you are, unless you let it. The day you let hunger decide your character is the day you lose something no amount of money can buy back." Nora had been perhaps 9 years old when her grandmother said those words, too young to understand their weight, but standing on that gray, rain-threatened sidewalk with a stranger's fortune in her hands, she understood them with a clarity that nearly brought her to tears. She closed the wallet, tucked it carefully into her apron pocket alongside her own $6, and walked back into the bakery to search for some way to find its owner. It took her nearly 20 minutes of searching through the wallet's contents to find a business card wedged into a hidden compartment behind the cash, a card printed on heavy cream stock that simply read Renfield Holdings, beneath the same name she had seen on the driver's license, along with a phone number. She almost did not call. Her hands hovered over the bakery's ancient landline phone for a long moment, the old fear of being dismissed, ignored, or treated as beneath notice creeping into her thoughts. People like her did not often get to speak directly to people like Sebastian Renfield. She had heard his name before, actually, mentioned once on the local news in connection with some enormous real estate development downtown, the kind of name that belonged to boardrooms and charity galas, not to conversations with a bakery worker who owned exactly one good pair of pants. But she thought of Milo, asleep at home under the careful watch of her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, and she thought that whatever fear she felt was not a good enough reason to fail the test her grandmother's memory had just set before her. She dialed the number. The call was answered not by Sebastian Renfield himself but by a clipped, efficient voice belonging to his assistant, a man named Curtis Ben, who initially seemed to assume the call was some kind of scam or solicitation. It took Nora several minutes of patient explanation, including describing the exact contents of the wallet down to the receipt from the jet charter company, before Curtis's tone shifted from suspicion to something closer to disbelief. "You're telling me you found $4,000 in cash and you're calling to give it back?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly with an emotion Nora could not quite place, perhaps skepticism, perhaps something gentler. "Most people who find something like this disappear. Where are you?" "I'll send someone right now." Nora gave the address of the bakery, then sat down on the small wooden stool behind the counter to wait, the wallet resting on the counter in front of her like something both precious and dangerous. She found herself, in that waiting silence, replaying the events of the past year in her mind, the humiliating conversation with a loan officer who had denied her application with barely concealed condescension, the night she had cried silently in the bathroom so Milo would not hear, the quiet dignity she had tried so hard to maintain even as everything around her seemed determined to strip it away. She thought about how easy it would have been, in this one single moment, to solve every one of those problems with money that technically belonged to someone else, someone so wealthy that its loss would likely never even register as a genuine hardship. And yet she had chosen otherwise, not because she expected reward, but because some things, once surrendered, could never be reclaimed. It was nearly 6 in the evening, the sky finally beginning to spill the rain it had threatened all day, when a black car pulled up outside the bakery. Nora watched through the rain-streaked window as a tall man stepped out from the back seat, moving with the unhurried, deliberate confidence of someone who had never once in his life needed to worry about being late, or unwelcome, or unseen. He was perhaps in his late 50s, his silver hair immaculately combed, his coat clearly expensive but understated in the way that true wealth so often preferred over ostentation. This was Sebastian Renfield, and as he pushed open the bakery door, the small bell above it chiming for the first time in hours, his sharp eyes swept the room and landed immediately on Nora, and on the wallet sitting on the counter before her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sebastian's expression was unreadable, the practiced neutrality of a man who had spent decades in negotiations where showing emotion meant showing weakness. He crossed the small shop in a few long strides and picked up the wallet, opening it with quick, efficient fingers to confirm its contents. Nora watched him count the cash, watched his eyes flick to the credit cards, the license, and she felt a strange, unexpected calm settle over her, the calm of someone who has already done the hardest part and has nothing left to prove. "It's all here," Sebastian said finally, his voice low and measured, tinged with something that might have been surprise. "Every dollar." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, taking in the flour dust still clinging to her sleeves, the worn state of her shoes, the tiredness etched into features that were otherwise still quite young. "Do you have any idea how much money this is?" $4,200, Nora answered simply. "I counted it, so I could tell whoever answered the phone exactly what I found. I didn't want anyone to think I might have taken something out." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation, perhaps, of assumptions he had not even realized he was making. "Most people," he said slowly, "would have kept it. Told themselves I'd never miss it. And they'd have been right, I wouldn't have. Not really. Not in any way that mattered to my bank account." He paused, glancing around the small, dim bakery, taking in the empty display case, the faded paint on the walls, the general air of a business surviving on fumes and the loyalty of a dwindling number of regular customers. "This place doesn't look like it's exactly thriving. And you don't look like someone with money to spare." Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks, an old, familiar shame at having her poverty observed so directly, but she held his gaze anyway. "I don't have money to spare," she admitted. "I had $6 in my pocket when I found your wallet. I was trying to decide if I'd spend it on bread for my son or save it for the bus. But it wasn't mine. The wallet, I mean. $6, that's mine, however little it is. $4,200 that fell out of your pocket, that was never going to be mine, no matter how badly I needed it." Something in Sebastian Renfield's carefully composed exterior seemed to crack slightly at those words, though Nora could not have said exactly what caused it. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its polished detachment. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nora. Nora Hargrove." "Well, Nora Hargrove," he said, "I think you and I need to have a longer conversation than the one we're currently having in a bakery that's about to close for the night. Would you allow me to buy you dinner? Not as payment, not as some kind of reward, just as two people talking, because I find I have questions I'd very much like answered, and I suspect you might have questions of your own." Nora hesitated. The instinct to protect herself, honed by years of disappointment, urged caution. But there was something in Sebastian's eyes, not pity, which she would have refused instantly, but a kind of genuine curiosity, almost respect, that made her reconsider. She thought of Milo waiting at home, of Mrs. Alvarez who would need to know she'd be a little later than planned, and she found herself agreeing, on the condition that she could first call to check on her son. What followed was not the dinner Nora might have imagined if she had ever allowed herself to imagine dining with a billionaire, not some glittering restaurant with menus devoid of prices, but rather a modest diner 2 blocks from the bakery, chosen deliberately by Sebastian, he explained, Because he wanted to talk somewhere Nora would feel comfortable rather than somewhere designed to remind her of the gulf between their circumstances. Over cups of coffee and plates of food neither of them ate much of, Sebastian told her, somewhat to her surprise, that he had grown up with very little himself, the son of a factory worker in a small industrial town, and that he had built his fortune through decades of relentless, often ruthless ambition that had cost him more than he cared to admit, including, he said with a flicker of something like grief crossing his face, a relationship with his own daughter, Charlotte, from whom he had been estranged for nearly 6 years after a bitter falling out over the company's direction following her mother's death. She accused me of caring more about the company than I ever cared about her, Sebastian admitted, staring into his coffee cup as though searching for answers in its dark surface. And the terrible thing, Nora, is that for a long time, I couldn't honestly say she was wrong. I built an empire and lost my daughter in the process, and today, of all days, a woman with $6 to her name teaches me more about integrity than anyone in my boardroom has managed to in the past decade. He looked up at her then, his eyes glistening slightly in a way that suggested this confession cost him something significant to make. I don't know how to fix what's broken with Charlotte. But I know I want to do something to help you, and I don't want you to refuse out of pride, because I suspect you have a great deal of that. Nora, who had indeed been preparing to refuse whatever offer was coming, found herself instead listening as Sebastian laid out a proposal that seemed almost too generous to be real. He wanted to invest in Hollow Bread, the bakery itself, providing the capital Margaret Doyle had never been able to secure to renovate the space, modernize the equipment, and expand into catering and wholesale, with Nora, whose baking skills he had already tasted in the small selection of day-old pastries she'd offered him alongside their coffee, positioned to become a manager and eventually a partner in the business as it grew. He wanted, additionally, to establish a modest trust for Milo's education, not as charity, he insisted, but as an investment in a family that had shown him something about character he desperately needed reminding of. It would be dishonest to say Nora accepted immediately or without hesitation. She spent that night lying awake beside Milo's small bed, turning the offer over in her mind, wary of strings that might be attached, wary too of a growth in circumstances so sudden it felt almost unbelievable, the kind of thing that happens in stories but rarely in the lives of women like her. She called Margaret Doyle the next morning, and together the two women met with Sebastian's lawyers, poring over documents late into several afternoons, ensuring that the terms were fair, that Margaret's ownership and dignity in the business she had built with her late husband were preserved, that nothing was being taken from her even as everything was being given. Over the following months, Hollow Bread transformed. New ovens replaced the ancient, temperamental ones that Margaret had coaxed along with what amounted to prayer and stubbornness. The shop's interior was repainted in warm, inviting tones, new tables and chairs installed, a proper display case built to showcase Nora's pastries, which, freed from the constraints of working with barely adequate equipment, blossomed into genuinely extraordinary creations. Word spread through the neighborhood and then beyond it, and within half a year, Hollow Bread had become one of the most beloved bakeries in the city, its line sometimes stretching down the block on weekend mornings. But the more meaningful transformation, the one that mattered far more than renovated ovens or growing profits, was the one that occurred in the relationship between Sebastian and his daughter Charlotte. It was Nora, in fact, who gently encouraged him toward reconciliation, sharing with him one afternoon, as they reviewed catering contracts together, her own experience of watching her marriage dissolve and understanding, too late, how pride so often stands guard over wounds that healing requires us to expose. "You have the money to build anything you want," she told him. "But you can't buy back time with your daughter. That's the one thing that only gets more expensive to lose the longer you wait." Sebastian, who had weathered hostile takeovers and boardroom betrayals without visible tremor, found himself moved nearly to tears by her simple honesty. He reached out to Charlotte that same week, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with a handwritten letter, the first he had written in years, acknowledging the ways he had failed her, asking not for forgiveness but simply for the chance to try again, slowly, without expectation. Charlotte, who had been carrying her own grief and anger like a stone in her chest for 6 long years, did not respond immediately. But 3 weeks later, she appeared unannounced at Hollow Bread, having heard through mutual acquaintances about her father's unusual new venture, curious despite herself about what could have prompted such a significant shift in a man she had long assumed incapable of genuine change. Nora was behind the counter that afternoon when Charlotte walked in, and though she did not know at first who the striking, dark-haired woman studying the pastry case with such careful attention actually was, something in her manner, a certain guardedness around the eyes that Nora recognized instantly, having worn that same expression herself for months after Daniel left, made her approach with particular gentleness. They fell into conversation, and it was only when Sebastian arrived 20 minutes later for their regular Tuesday meeting and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of his daughter sitting at one of the small café tables that Nora realized who she had been speaking with all along. What followed was not an instant, cinematic reconciliation. Real healing rarely moves so quickly or so cleanly, but rather the beginning of something slower and more durable, a father and daughter meeting for coffee at Hollow Bread every week, tentative at first, conversations circling carefully around old wounds before finally, gradually, addressing them directly. Nora watched this unfold over the following months with a quiet sense of gratitude, understanding that she had somehow become an unwitting catalyst for a healing neither Sebastian nor Charlotte had believed possible, simply by choosing, on one rainy Tuesday afternoon, to be honest when dishonesty would have been so much easier and so thoroughly unpunished. Milo, too, flourished in ways that broke and mended Nora's heart in equal measure. The trust Sebastian established covered not only his education but, at Nora's quiet insistence, was structured to teach him the value of work and gratitude rather than simply handing him comfort without context. Milo began spending Saturday mornings at the bakery, learning to weigh flour and shape simple rolls under his mother's patient instruction, taking enormous pride in the small, slightly lopsided loaves he was eventually allowed to sell to customers who, upon learning the story, always seemed to find his imperfect bread the most delicious thing in the case. His shoes, no longer held together with duct tape, were the least significant of the changes in his life, though Nora would later admit that watching him run and play without wincing from a blister caused by a broken sole had been the moment she allowed herself to finally, fully cry with relief rather than despair. There is a particular kind of transformation that occurs not in wealth or circumstance but in the way a person is finally allowed to exhale after years of holding their breath, and this was the transformation Nora experienced most profoundly. She had spent so long believing that her worth was measured by her ability to survive scarcity gracefully, that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to simply live rather than merely endure. Watching Milo laugh freely, watching Margaret Doyle's eyes shine with pride as she watched customers line up outside a shop she had once feared she would have to close forever, watching Sebastian Renfield, a man the world knew only as a ruthless titan of industry, weep quietly over coffee as his daughter finally called him Dad again for the first time in 6 years, Nora understood that the $6 she had once agonized over spending had, in a strange and beautiful way, purchased something far more valuable than bread or bus fare ever could have. It had purchased the preservation of her own integrity at a moment when abandoning it would have been not only easy but, by every practical measure, entirely justified. She thought often, in the months that followed, of her grandmother's words on that porch so many years ago, and she made a point of repeating them to Milo whenever the opportunity arose, hoping to plant in him the same seed that had, against every hardship, somehow taken root and flourished in her. Character, she told him, is not tested in moments of abundance, when generosity and honesty cost us nothing. It is tested in moments of desperate scarcity, when every circumstance seems to argue that compromising our values is not only forgivable but wise. It is in those moments, she told her son, that we discover who we truly are, and it is in those moments that the universe, or fate, or simple human decency operating through people like Sebastian Renfield, sometimes finds a way to notice. Before I share how this story truly ends, I want to ask you something, because I believe your answer matters more than anything I could write. If you have ever faced a moment where doing the right thing seemed impossibly costly, where honesty or integrity demanded a sacrifice that dishonesty would never have required, please tell us about it in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to find the courage to make the same choice Nora made. Our community here is built on stories like yours, so please, take a moment to share. By the time a year had passed since that rainy Tuesday afternoon, Hollow Bread had expanded into a second location across town, staffed largely by people Nora had personally recruited from the same neighborhoods of struggle and quiet desperation she herself had once inhabited, women and men who understood intimately what it meant to be given a genuine chance rather than empty promises. Margaret Doyle, now able to finally retire with dignity and financial security after decades of relentless labor, transferred full ownership of the original bakery to Nora, insisting with tears in her eyes that no one deserved it more, that watching Nora's honesty transform not just her own life but the lives of everyone around her had been the greatest privilege of Margaret's later years. Sebastian Renfield, for his part, became something of a quiet fixture at Hollow Bread, arriving most Tuesday mornings not as an investor checking on his interests but as a man who had found, in the warm, flower-scented air of that small shop, a version of peace that decades of boardroom victories had never provided him. He and Charlotte continued their slow, careful rebuilding, eventually working together on a foundation, funded generously by Sebastian, dedicated to supporting small businesses run by single parents, a foundation they named, at Charlotte's insistence, the Hargrove Initiative, in honor of the woman whose honesty had indirectly given her back her father. Nora, when she learned of this honor, wept for nearly an hour, overwhelmed not by pride but by the sheer improbability of it all, that $6 and a lost wallet on a rainy sidewalk could ripple outward into so much healing, so much unexpected grace, touching lives far beyond her own small circle of struggle. She thought of all the other mothers she knew, women working double shifts and stretching impossible budgets, women who would likely never encounter a billionaire's lost wallet or the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed her own life, and she understood that her story was not really about wealth at all, not fundamentally. It was about the simple, radical act of choosing honesty when dishonesty offered every practical advantage, and trusting that such a choice, even when it seemed to cost everything, might somehow, someday, be its own quiet reward. If Nora's story has moved you even a fraction as much as it moved everyone whose lives she touched, I hope you'll consider staying connected with our channel, because we are committed to sharing more stories like this one, true testaments to kindness, to forgiveness, to the second chances that so many people believe have vanished from this world but which, in fact, are waiting quietly around every corner for those brave enough to choose integrity even when no one is watching. Please like this video if her honesty inspired you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that goodness still exists and still matters, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another story capable of restoring your faith in the quiet, extraordinary decency still present in ordinary people. 2 years after that rainy Tuesday, Nora stood once more behind the counter of the original Hollow Bread location, now unrecognizable from the struggling shop it had once been, watching through the window as autumn leaves drifted past on a gentle afternoon breeze. Milo, now 9, sat at one of the cafe tables completing his homework, occasionally glancing up to watch customers admire the pastries he had helped shape that morning. Margaret Doyle visited most afternoons, no longer to work but simply to sit with a cup of tea and watch the legacy she and her late husband had begun flourish in ways she had never dared imagine. And on that particular afternoon, as she had every Tuesday for 2 years now, Nora watched Sebastian Renfield walk through the door, his silver hair a little grayer, his shoulders a little less burdened, his daughter Charlotte walking beside him, laughing at something he had said, the two of them radiating a warmth and ease that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had known them during the years of their estrangement. Nora smiled as she prepared their usual order, thinking, as she often did in these quiet moments, of the $6 that had once represented the entire boundary of her world, and of how far beyond that boundary her life had traveled since, not because she had chased wealth or fortune, but because, on one ordinary rainy afternoon, she had simply refused to become someone unrecognizable to herself for the sake of $4,200 that was never hers to keep. She understood now, with a clarity that had only deepened over the years, that her grandmother had been right all along. Poverty could strip away almost everything, but it could never touch who a person chose to be, unless they surrendered that choice willingly. And Nora, even in her most desperate hour, had refused to surrender it. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing what this story meant to you, share it with someone in your life who needs a reminder that hope and integrity still exist in this world, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like Nora's. Our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to believe, even briefly, in the possibility of kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, and it is our sincere hope that stories like this one continue to remind you, wherever you are in your own life and whatever struggles you may be quietly carrying, that honesty and decency are never wasted, even when the world seems to reward everything else instead. Thank you for spending this time with us, for believing in Nora's story, and for being part of a community that still, against every cynical odds, chooses to believe in the quiet, extraordinary power of doing the right thing.